Welcome to APUS History Period 2 Review. We're going to be looking at the Period 2, which entails 1607, the foundation of Jamestown, all the way to 1754, which is the start of the French and Indian War. This is the bulk of American colonization and development in this time period. It's going to be really focusing on English colonization, but there will also be Spanish, Dutch, and a little bit of French colonization mixed in there. Also on this review and on the period 2, the AP really likes to start playing in with written questions. So you may get an SAQ, you may get an LAQ from this time period. Much of the bulk of that written questions will focus on the cultural aspects of society. Also questions like the differences between the different colonial regions, developing different economic, social, or political aspects. Also, the College Board likes to play off the Great Awakening and the religious and cultural aspects and the development of those aspects during the 1700s. Typically, though, we'll see most of the questions focus on more the latter part of this time period and building into period 3. So there's a lot of carryover from period 2 to period 3, the age of solitary neglect, into the age of revolution. So there's a lot of continuation and change over time from these two periods. And that's where you see a lot of the bulk of the written responses from the AP. Let's get started right away. Okay, so the European settlement came in waves. Obviously, from the last review, we looked at the Spanish settlement being the first in the 1500s, being Florida, California, and New Mexico in North America. Again, typically this is going to be a smaller amount of the focus, with the bulk of the focus, of course, being on the British. The British are going to have their colonies starting with Roanoke in 1585, a lost colony, Jamestown in 1607, and the starving time that's happening there. Then you have the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth up in New England. France is also going to be developing colonies not only in New France, which is this area of Canada, up and down the St. Lawrence River with Quebec, Montreal, and eventually going into the Great Lakes and the fur trappers that are going to be all in this area, but also developing colonies in New Orleans, which is up here, and then up and down the Mississippi River. They're going to develop forts and fur trading outposts. They're going to be small in number, but they will have an effect eventually towards the end of this period and the onset of the French-Indian War. Also, the Netherlands is going to push it down a little bit. The Netherlands are going to be, sorry about that. The Netherlands are going to have a small colony in the area over right here in Pennsylvania, New Jersey area a little bit. Then also the biggest one is New York and up and down the Hudson River that goes right up there. That's going to be our bigger ones. So let's get into the colonization of the English first. The English are going to start off their colonization in these areas right here, the Chesapeake Bay region of Virginia and Maryland are going to be the area where they're going to be really focused on colonization, right up here. And the Europeans are going to arrive mostly at the very start in the Chesapeake area for riches, for gold and silver. They saw what the Spanish were doing. They had allures of getting rich on their own. Typically, when they came to America, they had crops and animals that were brand new to America, that they utilized. They brought weapons, plows, and other tools that are new to Americans. Also, disease is going to spread across America, wiping out many native tribes. So all these things are on the grander scheme of things. Again, the early colonial inhabitants, the ones in Jamestown, typically did not bring those things with them. They were looking for gold and silver and riches. Eventually, as the colonies developed and as more and more people will be coming over, they are going to have these things being brought over with them. Okay, Jamestown itself was called the Virginia Company, a joint stock company wanting to make a profit. When they got there, they picked a place that was ideal for defending themselves, but not ideal for growing a large community. It was wet, it was hot, it was in the swampy areas of Virginia, a lot of malaria, death, And the first couple of years, they had huge amounts of death toll, like up to 75, 85% of the colony will perish in this time period. This will be called the starving time because they will almost lose their colony when it comes to just basically dying out. Also, they're going to have a lot of problems with the Powhatan Confederacy, this group of Native Americans. This Powhatan, they were being taken advantage of by the whites. And the Native Americans did teach the whites what sort of crops to plant, but the whites and then the colonists did not treat the Powhatans very well. Eventually, what's going to be the lifeblood of Virginia will be the discovery that tobacco that was smuggled in there by John Rolfe will be the saving grace, the cash crop that they'll be able to survive upon and then make it economically profitable to be there. And obviously, tobacco is going to grow very well in that wet, hot, climate, with very, short winters and long summers. And England's going to have a huge demand for tobacco, which is going to allow this area in Maryland and Virginia to thrive in this area. However, though, with tobacco, it's a very intensive crop when it comes to labor. You need a lot of labor to basically serve this crop. They tried to put natives in labor roles. It did not work out very well. So to get more people to combine to basically have this tobacco crop, they needed to have a guaranteed labor source. Early on, that was not going to be African American slaves. The slaves are going to come later on in the late 1600s, early 1700s in more masses. They will have some slaves early on, but most of the labor is going to be used by these indentured servants. They're going to be these English people that are wanting to come over to America, and they're going to basically sign a contract to get them to be part of the American experiment. Many colonial leaders, colonial entrepreneurs will come over and are given a tract of land for coming over to America. But to get more land and to get more settlers over, the leaders of the colonies created something called the headright system, which allowed these colonists to gain land for every person they brought over. So it would be an incentive to bring over more indentured servants to work the land. These indentured servants were typically basically in a contract for 7 years of service. These were not only men, but also older children and also women who were in these servant contracts. And this is a very, very harsh condition. It wasn't slavery, but they were treated in a way that there was a very high death rate and very low life expectancy. And even when they did make it past their 7 years, they were not given land and they weren't given any, it was just sort of here you go. In Virginia, they also set up the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was this first governmental body, this representative body. Again, it was very limited. It was only basically land-holding and property-holding white males who could vote and have a say in this. And also, every decision had to still be approved by the Virginia Company and the leadership in charge. So it was, but again, it was the first sort of representative body set up in America that was sort of different than their European and English counterparts back in Europe. And eventually, as more and more land was being cultivated for tobacco production, more and more attention will be put onto the land availability and eventually the relationship between the Powhatan and the settlers. This is going to cause a series of rebellions and conflicts between the Powhatan tribes and Jamestown settlers, and eventually this is going to come into warfare. Both sides will suffer severe losses in this time period, with obviously the Europeans having more advanced weapon systems, but the Native Americans having more advanced numbers. In the end, the Powhatan will be pushed westward and into the more infringed areas of the Virginia colony, and the tensions will die down for the time being. Okay, the Chesapeake Bay colonies would be Virginia and Maryland, and you could even extend that a little bit into northern North Carolina eventually, which has very similar economy at all three areas. Once you get down to about halfway through North Carolina, you're going to see the economy switch to a different type of crop. But again, the Chesapeake Bay colonies, Maryland, Virginia, and the upper parts of North Carolina will all be based off this tobacco trade, this high cash crop trade that they're going to be using. In Maryland, it'll be a proprietary colony. And this colony is going to be given to Cecilius Calvert, or Lord Baltimore. And this is going to be founded for the full intent of being a very profitable colony for him. He also has a secondary purpose here, too. As a Catholic, he will set up a situation and a system of religious toleration through this Toleration Act of 1634. The reason he did that is to protect the minority Catholics that were in Maryland. They wanted to make sure that the more prominent and more populous Protestants do not sort of limit Catholic rights. So this is going to be a foundation, this Toleration Act, a foundation for early American religious freedom. And this will be a sort of a bedrock of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Again, it is really only protecting, though, other religions that are also Christian-based, like Catholicism, within Maryland. And even with this act, we're still going to see abuse and and intolerance towards Catholics throughout the history of America. But this will be a sort of a foundation for that constitutional First Amendment that we have. Okay, as Virginia expanded, so did the lack of land available to people. So there was a continued tension in the backcountry where there was, again, more and more limits put onto these backcountry farmers. For one, these backcountry farmers didn't officially own this land, so they didn't have voting rights in the House of Burgesses. Also, they were on the most infringed upon land. Thirdly, they were going to be in the most close proximity to the natives, so there was going to be these tensions between natives that were living in Virginia and these groups of settlers that had moved to the backcountry. The backcountry settlers were called the Piedmont group. Piedmont being mount, and again closer to the mountains or the Appalachian Mountains. The more wealthy landholders in Virginia are going to be part of this Tidewater region. And that's going to be the most coastal plains that have the best alluvial soil and the best for growing these large tobacco plantations. And what's going to come up out of this is Bacon's Rebellion. We see Nathaniel Bacon was a backcountry gentry, which means that he's a rich landowner. And in this situation, these landowners and these former indentured servants were wanting more protection from William Berkeley and the House of Burgesses and Jamestown to protect them from natives. And when natives had basically attacked white settlements, the settlers struck back, and that was extreme no-no. So what Jamestown did and what William Berkeley did is basically reprimand those backcountry settlers, because what Berkeley wanted was that good trade relationship with those East Coast and the Native Americans. Because of this, Nathaniel Bacon is going to sort of lead one of the very first early colonial rebellions in America, called Bacon's Rebellion. In the end, the rebellion is going to fail. Bacon's going to get dysentery. He's going to die. The rebellion will quickly sort of die down. There will be some long-lasting effects of this, and this is what the AP really likes to play off of. What were the causes of the Bacon Rebellion, and then what were the long-lasting effects of Bacon's Rebellion? The rebellion itself, very little attention is paid on that. Again, the causes, the lack of land, the lack of representation in the House of Burgesses, the lack of protection from Native Americans. Again, the bigger effects is that one thing, it showed that there was going to be this continuation of breaking of treaties with the natives. As Americas and the Americans become more populous, the need for expansion westward is going to be greater and greater. And we are going to constantly make treaties and then break them with the natives. It will also reveal tensions between the Tidewater and Piedmont regions, which is going to be a thematic thing in American history. Basically, the tensions between rich and poor, the landed class and the landless class. And probably the biggest thing and the biggest significance that the AP will play off on this is the importance of this rebellion on putting down indentured servants. Basically, the thought was that indentured servants will eventually gain their freedom after 7 years of contract labor, which means that they're going to need land and services from the colonies. And the issue was that the landowners wanted a more sort of defined and guaranteed labor source that was not going to become free after 7 years. And so we're going to see the importation and the increase of black slaves from Africa, not directly from Africa, but through the Caribbean, coming into America at ever increasing numbers. So we're going to see black slaves overtake labor source of the indentured servants in this time period. It's also important to note that in this time period, the late 1600s, another reason why indentured servants were falling in numbers was that England was going through their first industrial revolution at the very start of this time period. And so there was more opportunities for English men to gain employment within the English factories, so therefore they wouldn't need to come over to America. Excuse me. Okay, the second wave of colonization in America is going to be in Puritan New England. Two separate migrations, one being Plymouth and the other being Massachusetts Bay Colony. They both came over for similar reasons, but slightly different in their full intent. We see Plymouth is going to be in this area right here of the Cape Cod. Massachusetts is going to be up here. And then we're going to see branch out colonies, with Rhode Island being formed by Roger Williams. We're seeing Hooker forming Connecticut and New Haven. Eventually it's going to be the New Haven and Connecticut colonies, both coming together to be the Connecticut colonies. So first, the Plymouth colonies. Okay, the Plymouth colonies were a separatist colony. They were wanting to separate from the Church of England because they're of a religious intoleration. They eventually will first go to the Netherlands and not really receive much religious toleration there, go back to England, raise more money, and eventually sail to America on the Mayflower. William Bradford is going to be the leader of this colony, and it's not going to be all separatists and pilgrims are going to be over. It's going to be a mixed group of men and women on this ship, with probably about 70% being these separatist pilgrims and 30% is basically paying for passage over to America. On this ship, before they landed, they wrote the Mayflower Compact, which was a foundation for self-government in this new colony. Probably the most important line is about this becoming a civil body politic under God. So one, religion is going to be very important in the colonies. And second is that they're going to basically go to the civilians, the citizens of this area, to create laws and orders and contracts and constitutions moving forward. So this is going to be the foundation for what we have in America in regards to government and constitutions. The second colony is going to come over 10 years later, led by John Winthrop. Again, for religious reasons, but also for economic reasons, to set up this ideal colony, this city upon a hill, this beacon, what every other area should look towards as setting up a new area. This area that is going to be melded with very strict Puritan ideals and economic ideas, really focusing on the importance of family and town within this time period, of course, with spirituality and religion being at the top of the priorities. And these people were non-separatist because they were not wanting to actually separate from the Church of England, just reform it. Another part, they also had to be Puritan votes, so church and state was melded into one. And they adopted a state-supported religion and were very intolerant of anyone else in the colony that was not a full-flung Puritan. And the Puritan faith was very strict, very congregationalist. They believed in these ideas called predestination, that basically that by the order of God, when you were born, you were destined to either heaven or hell, and they ruled you in that way. Eventually, we're going to talk about the halfway covenant a little later on about religion, how the Puritan faith was dying out, and this was a way to increase membership within those Puritan communities. As Puritans came over, they came over in typically much larger family units than their counterparts in Chesapeake Bay. They were very connected to their farming communities. They came over with the intent of populating, not the intent of making big profits. Therefore, they also lived larger lives. Geography also speaking, less wet, swampy areas bred less diseases. The physical punishment of children was common with the the children having to obey very strict rules within the Puritan household, which also meant the children were also educated in many ways because they had to abide by reading the Bible and prayers and education through that. It was also a very patriarchal society, whereas a very male-dominated, where women pretty much had almost very limited, if not almost zero, rights for themselves. Because of the strict nature of this Puritan New England society, there were some dissenters. The two most famous ones was Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Roger Williams was a sort of a minister. He was one of the more, you could say, higher ups within the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he condemned the legal establishment of religion and state being melded into one. He wanted a separation of church and state. He also believed that Puritans should not seize land from Native Americans, but to buy it. So he was banished. He basically was told, you have to leave the colony. So he left and went to Rhode Island to establish his own colony where he's going to create a separation of church and state and religious toleration within that colony. It'll be the first colony to really push for a religious toleration, being one of the only New England colonies to do that, with Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts all being very strict religion-wise. The other person left for very different reasons. She absolutely believed in the Puritan faith, very much so, and the connection of Puritan and state. But she was a woman, and she had a very, very outspoken idea about what prayer services and the scripture should be like. And she also thought that as a woman, she should be able to hold meetings in her house, and she herself believed in revelation, that she could actually be and communicate with God herself. It wasn't just the ministers who could do that. So by doing that, she was questioning many things. She was, one, questioning the teachings of the clergymen. She was also testing this patriarchal society, that a woman could also sort of rise up and have a say in society too. So therefore she was arrested. And she was given a trial. And in the trial, she was able to sort of basically admit her guilt and be forgiven. She refused to, so she was banished. Eventually she'll flee to Rhode Island and then eventually to New York, where she will be eventually killed by Native Americans in New York. The Native Americans in New England were less in numbers and strength as their counterparts in Chesapeake Bay. Also, the Puritans did treat the Native Americans slightly better than their Chesapeake Bay counterparts. Again, not much. They still took their land. They still treated them very harshly. They basically did anything in their power to strip Native Americans of rights and land, which will result in several different wars, the Peacock War and Metacom's War eventually. One thing that they did do that was sort of different than Chesapeake Bay and sort of similar to the Spanish, was there was some attempt at conversion. These were called praying towns. This was an attempt to convert New England natives to Christianity. It was mostly a failed experiment. Very few Native Americans joined these praying towns, and the practice was abandoned by the late 1600s for the most part. The biggest war that the AP will deal with in this time period when it comes to Native American colonial war is Metacom's War, King Philip's War. Basically, the reason for this war was that many of the tribes had been selling off their land to colonists, and therefore the tribe's land had been dwindling to a point of basically not being able to be sustainable anymore. Metacom, of the Wampanoag tribe, formed alliances with other tribes of the Narragansett and the Nipmuc tribes of Rhode Island, along other tribes of Massachusetts. And the idea was basically to sell their land, buy guns, and then to create a rebellion and war to then take back their land. This will actually go sort of well for them in the very first year, but soon thereafter, basically the Native Americans are going to slowly succumb to, one, not having enough resources, two, not having enough weapons, and the three, these Native Americans were mostly farmers. And when they were in war and constantly on the move, they couldn't be farming. So they were pushed to the extremes of hiding in swampy areas and on the run. Thus, their tribes were constantly being, basically almost starving. Eventually, this war is going to end when the Mohawks, which will be contracted by the colonists, will basically kill Metacom, and the rebellion or war will die out. Both sides will suffer heavy losses, but the natives obviously were devastated by losing this war and thus being pushed to the fringes of the western areas of Massachusetts. Another colony, the Carolinas, doesn't really get tested on much on the AP. One important thing to really think about this, and when it looks at the differences between northern colonies like New York and New England colonies and southern colonies, the Chesapeake Bay and the Deep South, is this area right here. Is that South Carolina, North Carolina, eventually Georgia is going to have a heavy amount of slave labor within their colonies. Again, Virginia too, of course. And again, the biggest thing is that they're going to have cash crops, rice and indigo in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, tobacco bean in Virginia. Eventually, this cash crop is going to be turned to cotton in the 1800s. But that's the biggest thing to know about North Carolina and South Carolina. New York's to be set up as a colony for the Dutch. It's going to be a trading colony, with New York being established as a major trading post. They will also have farms and plantations up and down the Hudson River. Eventually, in 1664, New York will be ceded to the English by the Dutch. Basically, what the Dutch didn't want is basically war. England will force them to surrender the territory under the threat of war. Another colony was Pennsylvania, coming into existence in 1681. It was a proprietary colony given to William Penn's father, then given to him for a debt that was owed to him by Charles II. And Penn will be a Quaker, and he will set up Pennsylvania not only as a for-profit colony, but also as a refuge for Quakers. Because of this, he will set up his Penn's frame of government, which is really important to note. The reason why is that it will guarantee political liberty and religious freedom. So early on, Pennsylvania, you could really look at as being probably the most diverse colony of the colonies, with lots of people coming in. You see the Amish coming in, the German Mennonites, you see French Huguenots coming in that were non-Catholics. You're going to see Quakers there. Eventually, you're going to see lots of Scot-Irish coming in. This is going to be the most diverse colony of the American colonies. Also, it's going to be the colony that has the most freedoms, being most land availability for people, the most religious freedom, and also, for some part, women will be allowed to have some limited rights in Pennsylvania. Again, very low, but still some limited rights. Georgia, being our last colony formed in 1732, it'll be founded by James Oglethorpe. And the biggest thing is, look at this map again. We see these very, very lucrative cash crop colonies of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. And let me get back to here. And Spanish Florida way down here. So the thought was America wanted a buffer zone. The British wanted a buffer zone between the lucrative colonies of the cash crops of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Spanish Florida. So Georgia was formed as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the Carolinas. And this is going to basically be at the at the conclusion of the War of 1748, when a treaty will be created, and this will be granted to the British colonies as, again, it will be set up as this buffer zone. Okay, the crackdown of New England, the Dominion of New England, was a short period of time that is going to basically clamp down on British rule over the colonies. For the most part, England let the colonies do what they wanted to do socially, politically, and in limited forms economically. Pretty much there was very little regulation or rules that they had to abide by, except for some navigational rules and mercantilistic rules we'll get to in a few slides. But for a short period of time, James I will basically crack down on New England. This is going to be called the Dominion. They'll send Sir Edmund Andros over to New England, which encompasses also New York, to rule over this area with the iron fist, pretty much outlawing any type of colonial governments, basically getting rid of any type of colonial land grants that had already been set into stone. And this would be short-lived because a few years later, in England, we're going to have the Glorious Revolution. That's going to be capped with John Locke's Two Trustees of Government and his English Bill of Rights. And this is going to end this clampdown or this short period of domination over New England. And economic systems in America. It's all going to be predicated on this idea of mercantilism, where England is really wanting to have a state-supported manufacturing and trade system in America. England wanted to basically have the American colonies as the major source of raw materials to export their goods to England. And then they're going to make those raw materials into finished goods and then export those goods back over to America for a huge profit. And this is going to basically increase wealth in the home country. To keep that balance of trade intact and keep that balance of trade on the positive level for England, they're going to institute navigation acts. These acts are not just one single act, they're a series of several acts that did two things. One thing is that all goods must be on British or American vessels, meaning that any goods basically traveling to America must pass through some type of British customs or taxation first. It must be basically on a British or an American vessel to go to America, thus being able to be taxed by the British. Also, any types of American goods that are going to be produced are going to be limited. So if an American good competes with a British good, it's going to be outlawed. So for example, you're going to have the Hat Act, which will be an outlaw of American colonists making hats. What England wants is raw materials to be sent to England, England making hats, then to be sent back to America at a huge margin of profit. Part of this mercantile system will also be the triangle trade, this very complex network of trade routes between England and Europe into Africa and over to the Americans' colonies, including the Caribbean areas. The big focus of this triangle trade will be this middle passage. And that's going to be this leg of the route where slaves are going to be basically being delivered from Africa to the Americas. Again, most of the slaves will not go directly to the colonies. They will first go to the Caribbean islands, be sold into slavery, and then will eventually be sold to American planters in the South for the most part. And a big thing that the AP College Board likes to really play off is this age of solitary neglect. So this is an important fact to look at. This time period from 1650 to 1750 is really going to be a time period where England is going to do very, very little governing or interference in colonial affairs. The only thing they really govern or control is trade. And even with that, the British will pretty much react to any trade violations with a lot of ease, very little restrictions, very little, almost like a slap on the wrist, you could say. Even when colonists did smuggle in goods or break trade rules, again, very little was done to either enforce the rules or punish the violators of those rules. Again, this is really important because this shows CCOT, or continuation change over time, that this will end with the French-Indian War and the huge amounts of war debts that England incurs because of this war. And this will start in the next period, which is period 3. Okay, colonial economy, before we get into the last part of society and religion. The northern economy was very diverse. Pretty much it was small-scale industry, resource extraction, homespun industry, or artisan industry it's called, and there's also a large merchant class. In the mercantile system, one thing that the English allowed Americans to do is basically have their own ships. So many entrepreneurs will become shippers, and be a very lucrative amount of goods will come to America on the shipping areas. Even though there was a lot of diversity in the northern economy, still like 90+%, 95, 93% of all northern economy was based on agriculture. So again, even though there was small-scale industry and ironworks, there was resource extraction like lumber and fishermen and stuff like that, and homespun industries like being a blacksmith or a carpenter or a printmaker. Again, most Americans, most colonists in the North were farmers. Again, small-scale farmers at that, but were farmers. In the Southern economy, a little different. Most of the economy was based off these large-scale plantations. In Virginia and Chesapeake Bay Area, obviously, tobacco. In the South Carolinas, rice. In Georgia, South Carolina, indigo. Eventually, we'll see cotton along this, but cotton is not going to really come into place until after America became a country in the late 1700s and early 1800s. This economy was based on a boom and bust cycle, meaning that crops could be very lucrative at times, but also crash down when there's a flood of surplus in the market. So these crash crops were very, again, boom or bust. Also in the South, very few cities, almost a non-existent merchant class, and a very different type of labor source, with most of the labor source being focused on either black slaves and early on indentured servants. And again, agriculture, for the most part, we see tobacco, indigo and rice being the cash crops. And one important thing to note, the middle colonies, with Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York having a huge amount of importance with food production, with grain. They're called the breadbasket of the colonies. This will play a really important role in regards to the revolution. And huge amounts of food being grown in these middle colonies was also going to be a very important thing too. Colonial exports to America, to England, is going to be mostly, like I was talking about, these raw materials, the cash crops of the South, sugar molasses from the deep South, rum, eventually from the Caribbean, resource extractions of fish, lumber, and furs. What you don't see on this list is manufactured goods, finished goods. You don't see, goods like hats or clothing and stuff like that. One of the big economic problems in regards to colonial economy is that, one, even though there was navigation acts, they were lightly enforced, so you see huge amounts of smuggling going on. But the biggest problem, not enough specie. And that's important to know that word. That means hard currency, basically gold and silver. There wasn't enough of it. And England basically had these currency acts that made America not being able to print their own currency legally. So there's no common accepted currency. So trade was really rough in the colonies when there was not enough common currency to be able to use that as a form of trade. Okay, society-wise, one of the few African-American rebellions that happened was called the Stono Rebellion, also called the Cato Rebellion in some AP sources. This was one of the really only slave rebellions of note in colonial times. It happened in South Carolina, and South Carolina slaves basically had escaped and fled to try to basically escape to Spanish Florida. On their path to Spanish Florida, they killed many whites, but it did fail. The slaves will be captured. Either they will be killed and hung, or they will be put back into slavery. And what this is going to do, it is going to create a much more restrictive system. Really important to know is what this is going to create is these new black codes, or they're also called slave codes. And what this is going to do is establish actual laws of what is and what is not a slave. What can whites do legally to the slave groups? And so that's going to be a new development in these periods, these new slave codes, actually making slavery a legal system, because early on, slavery was just sort of this labor system, where there wasn't really much rules when it comes to what a slave is, what a slave is not, what happens to the offspring of these slaves, and stuff like that. Okay, religious issues in the colonies. The first religious uprising or movement, you could say, was the Halfway Covenant in the 1660s in New England. What it did, basically what was happening, was that there was a decrease of Puritan congregation and Puritan converts. And so to get more people involved in Puritan faith, they created this Halfway Covenant. What it did, it allowed children of congregations to practice and participate in church activities, even though they were not a full converted person within the Puritan faith. Basically, as long as you had parents who were these converted Puritans or these full Puritans, practicing Puritans, you'd be able to participate. And really what it was to do is also to increase the church membership of this younger generation. Religion in the colony was very diverse, something that the AP likes to play off of. It's important to know that especially in the Pennsylvania and areas, there was a lot of immigrants who came for religious freedom. There was a large array of religions that coexisted in the areas. There was Scots and Irish, there was Catholics, there were some Jewish people within New York areas, there was Protestants in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, there was hardcore Puritans in New England. A very diverse religious group. There was German Mennonites, there was French Huguenots, again, a lot of that. But typically, only Christian religions. There was witchcraft in the colonies, again, to some point, mostly in New England. Again, there was other areas of the South that had some too. But in New England, it affected the most greatly, with the Salem witch trials being the most famous. It affected both men and women. And typically, we could say that it wasn't actually due to real witchcraft. Most of the tensions were probably of economic hardship between different groups of people within the communities. And tensions probably rose because of that, where they used witchcraft to blame for that. The biggest religious movement of the time period was the Great Awakening, though. This was the early 1700s through the mid 1700s. And the reason for this was the decline of religious piety or passion. It started out with John and Charles Wesley coming over and into the South and trying to convert people to Methodism. It also had George Whitefield, an English preacher, an itinerant preacher, traveling up and down the coast of and the parts of the colonies, getting people to be very passionate, these outdoor preachers, these evangelicalist preachers, to have more say in the religion. Probably the most famous of the new Great Awakening preachers was Jonathan Edwards. And he was very different because he was a fire and brimstone preacher, preaching predestination and the salvation of God is going to basically be, you're born with it, and basically trying to scare people into believing. He had sermons of trying to make hell this fiery and brimstone. He compared people to a spider, and God was just basically dwindling the spider over the pits of hell, trying to scare you into submission of believing in the faith. It spread across the colonies, again, very differently in the different colonies. It did lead to divisions of congregationalists and congregations between new lights and old lights. So the new lights were these revivalists, these new ways of thinking. The old lights were the traditionalists. And it awoke many colonies to new ideas in religion, education, and thinking. One thing we could say that this led to is Americans questioning the role of ministers and the teaching of ministers and their old light traditions. A lot of historians will say this will lead Americans to start questioning authority just in general, which you think about the time period of the 1700s, this will prelude the Revolution and us questioning the authority of the British king. So there is some combination there. You could look at some cause and effect. Well, this was not the cause of the Revolution, but some of the ideas or the inspiration in this will relate to revolutionary ideas. And it's all connected to Enlightenment, basically new ways of thinking, different ideas within society. Increased scientific knowledge is going to become more of a mainstay. Benjamin Franklin was the leading Enlightenment and scientist in America. We're going to see the inoculation of smallpox becoming a popular idea, and that's going to be something that's going to be spread throughout American colonies. Where we can actually inoculate this form of vaccine, you could say. We're also going to see an increased education in America, especially in New England. The first college is going to be Harvard, and then colleges are going to sort of spring up in the New England states and the northern states. Would be Princeton in New Jersey, and Brown in Rhode Island, and Yale in Connecticut, just to name a couple, Columbia in New York, Penn in Pennsylvania. Most of the colleges being in the north, with really only William and Mary being the only southern college. Also, we're going to see most New England children learning how to read the Bible and having literacy being a big part of their upbringing. So therefore, we're going to see more newspapers becoming more popular, more print media becoming more popular in the north. Also, almanacs are going to be the biggest form of probably print there is besides periodicals and newspapers. Probably the most famous one historically is the Poor Richard's Almanac, published by Ben Franklin as a pseudonym. And that's it for period 2. I hope this helps. Get studying with this. Again, this is the first period that you may have some writing on. Typically, sometimes there is an LEQ. Most likely there will be an SAQ looking at this time period. Again, a lot of times the LEQs and the SAQs will really look at the differences between the colonial regions, or in many cases for SAQs, the differences or similarities between different colonies themselves, like the Spanish colonization compared to the American colonization. Again, the AP likes to play off that a lot, looking at similarities and differences among regions of American colonies or among different colonial experiments. Hope this all helps, and get studying. We'll do period 3 next one. Have a great day, guys.